I've tried to show in previous talks how we, the 99%, cannot trust our trusted leaders. I've tried to teach a vitally important lesson, that as far as doing what's best for us, the 99%, is concerned, we're entirely on our own. Those we trust to do what's best for us, those who have both absolute political power and absolute monetary power, the 1%, are too busy doing what's best for themselves to concern themselves with doing what's best for us, even if they wanted to. We're conditioned to work hard, to take care of ourselves and our families, and we're conditioned to despise those who need the help of the state to survive, and whom we're conditioned to think of as sponges. One of the many things we're not conditioned to realise is that those who sponge the most from the state are the 1% themselves, and they always have been. The fact that the 1% continue to get away with this confidence trick year after year, generation after generation, and century after century is due to several reasons, such as the occasional use of raw, naked brutality against us by the 1%. Powerful and effective though this technique obviously is, it only accounts for some of the explanation for why we continue to allow the 1% to have such absolute power over our lives. By far the most effective long-term tool they use is control of public information. Because the 1% wholly control public information, they wholly control how and what we, the 99%, learn about them, via our school history lessons, for example, and how we learn, or, as is more often the case, do not learn, what they're really up to on a daily basis, supposedly on our behalf. This talk will focus on a very powerful ally of the 1%, the media. I'll try to show how the illusions and lies we start to learn from the moment we're born, which are sold to us as gospel truth, and which I've covered in previous talks, are continually peddled to us throughout our lives by the mainstream media in the shape of so-called news, and also, more perniciously, in the form of entertainment of one form or another. The 1%, in the human form of a monarch, say, or a president, have always promoted and maintained two very powerful controlling illusions. Firstly, that the 1% should have awesome political power over our lives, and secondly, that they should have this awesome power because they're always driven by a selfless desire to do what's best for us, the 99%. These controlling illusions, taught initially in our childhood, are maintained and nurtured throughout our lives by the media, a media controlled by and subservient to the 1%, and which carefully cultivates its very own controlling illusion in order to do so, the illusion that the media tells us the truth. The 1% have always known the immense power of controlling information, and from the earliest days of recorded history, when ancient marauding empires destroyed the public libraries of conquered lands, through the Dark Ages when the 1% used Latin as a sort of secret language that was exclusive to them and their flunkies, the priests, through the countless episodes of public book burnings, through the so-called Industrial Revolution, when ordinary people were sometimes taught how to read, but not how to write. Right up to today, when the 1% spy on every electronic message we send, but persecute and imprison those who try to reveal to us what the 1% are up to. So there's a very long and impressive history of how the 1% have always ensured that they, and they alone, control the information that we, the 99%, receive. This point wasn't lost on George Orwell when he wrote his most famous work. Who controls the past, controls the future, he wrote. Who controls the present, controls the past. He might also have added, who controls information, controls the present. I'd like to begin this talk by making a brief diversion to highlight the subject of language. This might seem a little strange, but please just bear with me. As George Orwell knew more than 60 years ago, language is an essential tool of control, not just in the obvious sense as a means of communication, but also in a far less obvious way, spreading deceit. When Orwell invented Newspeak, it was widely thought that he had Nazi and communist propaganda in mind. But he might have been thinking how his own government manipulated language too, or how the newly emerging empire was doing so as it started to flex its muscles. Orwell clearly understood the trick of spreading deceit simply by inverting the true meaning of words. Although his work was fiction, the trick has been used in real life by our trusted leaders for a very long time. For example, Noam Chomsky relates how, in 1945, the US War Department dealt with the apparent paradox of Russian plans to influence other countries, which were obviously bad, compared with US plans to influence other countries, which were obviously good. So the phrase that was adopted to make this hypocritical US position publicly acceptable was that they were a logical illogicality. Orwell probably hadn't heard that phrase when he invented Newspeak, but it might have been the sort of thing he had in mind. The vast majority of us think that most of the everyday words we use pretty much have just one meaning, and that we know what those meanings are. Not many people grasp the fact that a lot of words we take to mean one thing, when used by our trusted rulers, actually mean the exact opposite, and that this is deliberately done for very cynical reasons. There are countless examples of this, such as this one, provided by a typical one-percenter, President Ronnie Reagan. Investigative journalist Tim Weiner tells the story in his excellent book on the history of the CIA, Legacy of Ashes. And I quote, Reagan told Congress, "Let us be clear as to the American attitude toward the government of Nicaragua. We do not seek its overthrow. Our purpose, in conformity with American and international law, is to prevent the flow of arms to El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica." That sounds very reasonable, doesn't it? The sort of thing you might expect to hear from the most powerful man on the planet and the supposed champion of freedom and democracy and the rule of law. However, there was one small problem with it, as Weiner explains. Those 3 sentences contained 3 lies. First, the United States did seek to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. Second, it violated both international law and American law, as the World Court and the Congress later determined. And thirdly, rather than stopping the flow of arms to El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica, the United States moved heaven and earth to send as many weapons as it could from as many nations as possible to generals and guerrillas in those 4 countries. Mr. Weiner actually missed a 4th quite important lie: Reagan's use of the words, "let us be clear," which is still a very popular phrase we hear today from the mouths of our trusted leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. Because what's become abundantly obvious was that what Reagan actually meant was, let's see how many lies we can pack into 3 sentences. But Reagan wasn't the first US president to lie, not by a very long way. And of course, he was far from being the last. From the very earliest days of America's journey to world domination, its leaders routinely lied to Native Americans whilst stealing their land, and they lied to their own people and the rest of the world about how much they opposed empire and championed freedom and democracy, whilst at the same time colonizing as much of the Americas as they could steal. It's exactly the same trick that's still being used today, with the same old lies about our supposed champions of freedom and democracy still being peddled. The blatant lies and deceit of our trusted leaders is completely normal, and always has been. There are many books written on the subject, and the evidence is very considerable. For example, investigative journalist Izzy Stone spent more than 5 decades unpicking the deceit of governments, mainly his own, and a biography of his life uses for its title the guiding principle that he always used: all governments lie. And Martha Gellhorn, a great foreign correspondent with more than 60 years of experience of reporting from around the world, advised we should, and I quote, "never believe governments, not any of them, not a word they say. Keep an untrusting eye on all that they do." I think the above words by Kennedy and Reagan more or less justify the views of both Izzy Stone and Gellhorn. For the uninitiated, it's quite shocking and deeply unsettling to discover for the first time that governments really cannot be trusted. Many people have a vague contempt for their own governments, but they don't know the extent of the problem, that our own trusted leaders routinely say and do things quite deliberately which actually harm their own people. As much of this talk is about the information we're given in the shape of something called news, let's take a little more closely at that word. There's an automatic assumption in most people's minds that our so-called news undergoes some sort of triage process, whereby all the millions of events that happen all around the globe every day are filtered by good and wise people in such a way that only the most important information is passed on to us. That is not, in fact, what happens. The filtration that does indeed takes place to serve the usually hidden and unstated purposes of the 1%. Take, for example, the last few months of Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq prior to the illegal Western invasion there. Any little hardship being endured by the Iraqi people was deemed important enough to appear on our TV screens as supposed justification for the planned illegal invasion and illegal overthrowing of Saddam. The cause of the people's hardship would of course be blamed on Saddam, with hardly any mention at all of the ruthless sanctions regime being imposed by our trusted leaders, and which accounted for the deaths of over 500,000 Iraqi children. But today, long after the illegal invasion, when Iraqi citizens are still being murdered at the rate of about 100 people a week, the events of that desperate country are no longer considered newsworthy. Now we've supplied it with freedom and democracy. An almost identical situation happened with the illegal overthrow of Libya's Colonel Gaddafi, and was then tried again almost immediately afterwards in Syria. In the cases of both Iraq and Libya, our so-called news never missed an opportunity to highlight the hardships of ordinary people prior to the illegal overthrowing of the governments there, but immediately forgot about those hardships, which increased many times over the moment Saddam and Gaddafi were crushed. There are countless other examples of how this word news is manipulated in this way, and I'll be referring to them throughout this talk.